Welcome, everyone, to Intro to Grant Writing Government Edition. This is one of our series of webinars in the Intro to Grant Writing, Intro to Fellowship series. And by request, we're going to be talking about some particular examples of government funding that you can apply for. Now, these webinars are always best when we're answering questions that you are interested in. So if there's a particular area that you are interested in applying for funding for, whether now or down the line, or you're just curious how things work, please feel free to mention that in the chat room. With no further ado, let's talk about some preliminaries. So there's some terms that are sometimes used synonymously, but tend to have their particular foci: scholarships, fellowships, and grants. Now, in general, a scholarship is a financial gift of some sort that does not have to be repaid. Now, it may require meeting some eligibility conditions. For example, by the way, if you are watching this right now, we do our own recording that will be posted later today. If you'd like a copy of that, just drop your email address either in the chat or send it to me via private message. So scholarships may have these eligibility requirements, and that might be you're enrolled in a particular major. It might mean that you have a GPA requirement or a service requirement that it could be enrolling in a particular class, could be attending this activity. For example, when I was in undergrad, I had a scholarship from the university that was a academic scholarship and required that I maintain a certain GPA. I also later in my senior year was awarded a scholarship that required that I be a music major, which fortunately I was. And so there are these eligibility conditions either to get the award or to keep getting the award. Now, fellowships are generally considered to be more prestigious. Hopefully they're coming with more money, a larger amount as well. But a fellowship will usually have some sort of service commitment. So for example, you might have a fellowship for graduate studies that requires that you be doing service or administrative work for a department. And I recall that when I was a doctoral student, I had a fellowship that I got that required that I publish my research, which is a great requirement to have when that's something you want to do already. So the service commitments are not necessarily onerous. There's a particular fellowship, the Presidential Management Fellowship, that's offered by the federal government, and you get that, and the commitment for that is to work for the federal government for 2 years. Now, there are other things that might have a service commitment that is separate from the award itself. So, for example, the Bourne National Security Fellowship, which is a fellowship for foreign language studies of so-called strategic languages. This particular fellowship type requires that you make a good faith effort to either work in the nonprofit or government sector for 2 years afterwards. And I say good faith because if there's say a massive cutback in or freeze in government hiring, as has happened many times since I was a graduate student, you are not required to do it if you've been trying in good faith and it just doesn't work out because of things outside your control. Now, grants are sums of money that are given by some sort of organization for a specific purpose, and these come in individual and organizational varieties. We're going to be talking a little bit more about the organizational varieties to start, but if you have a particular interest, again, please let me know. Now, an example of a research grant. So I got a grant to go and do research at the Hagley Library in Delaware. And if you're not familiar with it, the Hagley Museum and Library, this is on a former DuPont family estate and the grounds of what was once one of the largest gunpowder factories in the country, operating for more than a century. And this is a library that has grants you can apply for to do research with their collections. So often when a grant is given, it's because there's something that they want to further, And so it's polite to if you get that grant, to do the thing that they want. Now, it also happens that you could, live on this wonderful estate and see deer on your way into the library. Uh, but that there's this desire for you to produce something, and it's usually not something that's, again, onerous. But if you get a grant to, say, do a year of field research or to investigate a problem, it's good to do that. The granting organizations tend to not like it when you do something else with the money. And so organizational varieties of grants generally have a contract that you sign that says this will be spent only as agreed. And then if you propose to do something different, then you should ask. And often they will agree to reasonable changes. But if you say apply to do a study of, let's say, music therapy with PTSD, and then you say, well, I'd like to spend this on studying hula dancing, they're probably going to say that's not really what we approved, and might ask you to return the funds or not disperse them in the first place. Or, you get the idea. Now, with fellowships in particular, we want to distinguish between internal and external. Internal in the institutional sense would be what is going on at ACU within the institution. So if your department were to give you a fellowship, that would be an internal award. If you applied for a research grant from ACU, that would be an internal one. An external would be something that is outside of ACU. And one of the reasons we ask people to share what program they're enrolled in is because often there are things that are of interest to them in their particular area that we might let them know about things beyond and their department, and sometimes beyond the university as well. So now let's talk about how you might find these things. So if you're looking for fellowships, there are some places you might start, like the Duke University search tools for the funding opportunities database that they have. Fabulous, easy to use. UCLA has the GRAPES database. One of my colleagues at Boston University started a website called ProFellow to make it easy to find fellowships and grants. And so these are some examples, and I think it would be helpful if we took a look at one of those. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen. And as sometimes happens, they change the URLs. So I'm opening that one up and I'm finding I'm being directed to a new place. So let me just get that loaded and then I will share that. And by the way, we will update our slides to reflect the new location here. So you should now see my screen here. And so we have the Duke Research Funding Database. So let's say that we are interested in education research. You could type in research, but it's going to be fairly redundant because this is about funding for research. So let's type in education. And we see that we've got a lot of stuff. In fact, 1,600. Okay, that's far more than we can look at. And probably there are some areas that you're not interested in. Say, if engineering and physical sciences aren't your field, you're probably less interested in all of these Department of Defense things. Now, that's where discipline comes in, and we can look at what might be registering your interest. So we have curriculum development. Oh, more than 500 opportunities. Okay, well, if education is your thing, that is something where there's definitely a lot here. And we can see that there are all these different paths. So in fact, American Indians into nursing to help our Native American and brethren along that educational pathway. We have stuff from health and human services, a lot of stuff ranging from science, technology, engineering, and math, and going in many other directions. So let's look at some of those other things that you might be checking off here. So who's eligible? So if you're attending this webinar, you're probably a graduate student or an undergraduate who is looking towards something that will take you on the graduate student path. So we have this checkbox, graduate and professional students. So we might look at this and see, we have a much smaller group to look at and see, does this align with any of our interests here. Now, if we look at this, well, as it happens, I spent 2021 to 2022 in Madagascar working with a whole bunch of lemur researchers, among other things, while I taught at the university. And so if you're interested in that kind of thing, you're doing it already, perhaps you have to do it for your degree, then we can see that this might be something that is very much of interest. Now, you can see that the deadline for this was on April 7th. And most grants will have their deadlines be due at approximately the same time each year. So if I were to peek at my calendar briefly, I'd see that, April 7th was the first Friday in April of this year. So it's probably going to be the first Friday of April next year. So somewhere around April 5th. And so if you're looking at this and saying, this is something I really want to do, I would go ahead and put a note in your calendar for March or February to look for that. And in fact, you'll see that it's not just the research grants at the top. If you're doing work in this area, there are probably things that you might be interested in as well. Now, I'm making a mental note for this to send it to some of my lemur researching friends, because I don't do research on lemurs. I love to chase them through the forest with my camera and take pictures, but I'm not doing research on them. But they are, and I believe that one of my colleagues, professor, got one of these awards. I think this one here. So last time we talked about this, they didn't mention that they were applying for this, so I'm just going to remind them about that. Now, let's talk about another couple examples just to practice reading and the postings. So here we have this summer course development grant. Now, this is an internal one. This is if you were teaching at Duke University, then you'd be eligible for this. And you'll see this is tagged as Duke internal funding. So if we're looking at someone else's database, we want to be looking for external funding. So you see this institutionally limited. So this is not necessarily the most intuitive way of understanding it, but if it's true, that means yes, it is limited to people at the institution, in this case, Duke, and false is it's not limited, so everything else there. So you can see that we have a quick way of screening things here to make sure that we're not spending time looking at stuff that is not helpful. Now, here's an interesting one. This Dear Colleague letter, grant opportunities for academic liaison with industry. Now that I remember when this was announced, this is a interesting program where you're looking to work across not only disciplines, but also to partner between university and industry. And I remember this being very interesting because I had a colleague who was working in a more rural area, and they looked at this and said, oh my gosh, I was talking with someone who works at that factory. This is exactly what we need to propose something to meet their needs, which is a good starting point for planning your proposal to say, here's a problem, we'd like to work on a solution. And most grants are approaching things that way. There is some problem that you identify and you propose working towards a solution. Now, sometimes it's a problem that involves needing to just understand what's going on. So some of my friends who were doing lemur research were doing a catalog to try and find out, okay, how many lemurs live in this area? Because if you know how many live there, you can find, is the population growing? Is it shrinking? Or is it staying about the same? And if you don't know that, then it's hard to tell what's there, especially if they're nocturnal. And by the way, mouse lemurs are super, super cute and also nocturnal. So just to show you what I am talking about, I'm going to now share a picture of a mouse lemur. This is in fact a mouse lemur that I saw in person. I'm the person who took this photograph. We were working in the dry rainforest in southwest Madagascar, and tagging these levers. So if life puts you in that place, there's some advantages there. All right, back to our research here. So when we are looking at opportunities, you have a number of questions. First of which is this something that you are eligible for? And you can start with looking at the eligibility criteria here. The second thing is this something that is practical for you to apply for? And that's a big question because we don't want to spend so much time applying for things that it just becomes a bad return on the investment. If you spend 100 hours applying for things to get a $500 award, that's a terrible per hour rate. So you want to find things that speak to your strengths, that perhaps you are looking to work towards in the future, but that are doable. And this happens to be something where if you're working with someone who's already applied and received National Science Foundation, that's NSF funding, it's a lot easier. If it's your first time, then maybe you want to do something else. So let's go back and look at one of those other resources now. All right, so we have ACU's own Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. So this is going to be internal resources. So let's go ahead and take a peek. Now we have a variety of internal grants that are listed here. And so we want to look at see first, is this something that would be eligible to you? Now, this is student grants. If it's being routed through the Office of Undergraduate Research, then if you're a graduate student, probably less of interest. Faculty grants, eligible for faculty. Now, we do have some faculty who are students as well. So that might be something that you are interested in. And then here we have the Cullen grants, also faculty. So looking at this, you'll see that, as is the case with many universities that have a primarily undergraduate level, a primarily undergraduate student body, you'll find that the centrally listed awards here are primarily oriented towards undergrads and faculty. Now, when you're at a teaching university where there's a large population of students being taught by graduate students, there's usually a lot of departmental level fellowships and assistantships and things like that. But I would say generally at ACU, if you are looking at what you might do, there's an incentive to look outside the institution because there are more opportunities by far than those purely at ACU that are eligible for graduate students. It's not to say they don't exist, but if we were to back up here, and we're just going to clear everything here, and we're going to then go ahead and look at a few things here. Hold on. Wait for that to catch up with us. All right, all opportunities, we're going to go ahead and set our eligibility to graduate professional students. And we're also going to go ahead and, nope, we don't want institutionally limited. We want the opposite. We not limited to institution. Now we're also going to go ahead and look at funding type. And this is where those distinctions, fellowship, grant, award, scholarship, prize, stipend. Let's take a look at that one. So you see that these stipends are for paying you while you are doing some type of activity. So for example, this is in medical education. This is to work at the Carter Center in the Atlanta metro area. And one thing that people sometimes do is they will track down a stipend opportunity that aligns with something that they want to do anyway, or need to do anyway. And you can see that some of these, the name sounds like fellowship. So there is a little overlap in what may be classified there. But the general idea is the stipend is paying you to do a specific bit of work. And this may be more focused than a more open-ended fellowship. So let's take a look at some of the options here. So here's an example. So the Junior Fellows Program at the Library of Congress is a multidisciplinary opportunity to do work at the Library of Congress. And usually people will use their access there because you get access to do things outside the normal hours. They'll use their access during the fellowship period to work on something else. But the stipend is enough to pay their living expenses while they are in the area. And you can see that this is very broad. In fact, the Library of Congress has multiple awards. Let's go ahead and take a peek at their website. The Library of Congress has basically the same deadlines every year, and they have the same offerings. So you can see there's this internships and fellowships page that I can jump over to here. And it runs a broad range. We have folk life, culture, anthropology. We have archaeology. We have archives, history. There are business and education in allocations that they have listed here, health and spirituality. And so people do come to the Library of Congress for all sorts of reasons across the spectrum because they are, this is the copyright library for the United States. It's got a bit of everything. So let's say we are turning things back. And since I saw someone mention information technology, let's take a look to see what comes up if we were to just type in information technology. Now that's something that can be approached through a number of different areas. You see the Department of Defense has a bunch of awards there, NIH, NSF, more National Endowment for the Humanities. But I think that if we go ahead and look by discipline, that will help us narrow things down a little bit more. Because if we're looking at information technology in the context of teaching, that might take us in a particular direction where, yes, there's certainly things related to that here, but is the interest in terms of teaching? Is it in terms of architecture? Is it in terms of management? All of these would inform where we go looking. So with that in mind, let's look at another database here. So we're going to jump back to our slide deck here. So we looked at internal resources, and now we can look at, we have some other special things. Like if you're looking just for a fellowship, or you're looking for opportunities to study abroad, something I certainly endorse myself. And you might be looking at something in the realm of nursing research or federal research grants. Those are generally tending to be larger and institutional rather than individual. But let's go ahead and take a look at something. So I'm going to go ahead and load something in my web browser in the background and think, what would you search if you were doing a query? Let's say you're doing a search out there for funding for information technology research. What would you search for? Well, I can tell you that you are going to want to have funding in there somewhere, whether that's with the word funding or the word grant. But if you just start looking, and you can see just a search for information technology administrative research funding gets us some results, but it's not really kind of leading us towards the here's something you can apply for. Now, if you're looking for something in the realm of a government grant opportunity, your central clearinghouse for institutional grants, things that you might apply for with a professor. That's going to be grants.gov. And we'll talk about some particular databases as later. But grants.gov is the central clearinghouse where federal government funding opportunities are listed. Now, this is something where if you are working with someone doing research in this area already, then it's often helpful to be able to look at their notes, to see what they're doing and map your knowledge of what they're doing onto what you see here. Now, grants.gov, since it's a federal clearinghouse, you will see things of many different levels. Now, this is another Department of Defense thing. That's a big thing. That's a large project. That's not something that, as an individual, you're probably going to be wanting to apply for. That would be something working on a team. Now, if we went ahead and looked at, let's go ahead and check education here, we see that this is narrowing down a little bit. And we have various things that are going through this agency here. DOC would be Department of Commerce. ED would be Department of Education. So let's take a look at what we see here for this first thing. And this is a piece that is linked to a recent piece of legislation that was passed into law. And you can see that, oh, this is probably going to be happening in a particular band of time. And we're talking a lot of money here. So you'd expect that you need a large organization to apply for and be competitive for that. Now, I will say that my most successful student for grant applications got a multi-million-dollar award from a state government entity. And so even if it's not something you're applying for now, it may be something that comes up later. The duty of most graduate students, I would say, is to succeed at what you're doing right now. So that's usually some element of finish the degree, do well in the courses, and by that I mean pass the courses. If you have exams, pass the exams. If you have a thesis or dissertation, write and complete that, ideally in something close to your planned amount of time. But if you are looking at a project that you want to focus on, and you're looking for funding for that, that is something where you might be looking in a more specific capacity. Now here, you'll see that eligibility, we have individuals. Let's collapse that. Now we see a much smaller realm of things here. Now, this, let's look at this one here. So I have a friend who did a similar award in a previous year. So this award is looking for people to do research on languages and to spend time going and recording it, perhaps working on a dictionary or other materials like that, and produce a product that could easily be a major part of a dissertation. Now, that's the sort of thing where if you're looking at, I haven't picked an exact topic, but here are the kinds of things that I'm interested in. You see this, you're like, oh, hold on, I can do that. And that's one of the purposes of looking sooner rather than later to think about how your ideas, your interests, your needs might be shaped into a more specific product by virtue of having these opportunities that you can see, oh, hold on. If the grant is normally 30,000, that is enough to do work in most third world countries for a year easily. All right, let us look at one more thing. Just a moment. So when you're looking at something that is discipline specific, like these examples from nursing research, these are helpful for knowing what's been specifically curated and put together for that discipline. Now, information technology research, the tricky part for a topic like that is going to be that a lot of the research is in more of the pure science, and then separating into things like, computer programming, uh, modeling, uh, management theory. And so those are all different areas that could be the source of the funding that you're looking for. So let me do a quick search in the background. So one of the more interesting things that comes up is that if you have a field that has some regular problems with dealing with information, challenges that they are generally looking for ways to get on top of that. So, for example, the US federal government, since we're doing a government focus, US federal government has a variety of entities that deal with a lot of people. And so, if you cooperate and load, we have these early doctoral student research grants that are available to help work around a particular problem that they have noticed. And if you think, well, benefits.gov, what kind of problems do they have? Well, when you've got millions of federal employees, then you can have a lot of stuff there. So we can see here there in general, we have, okay, it must be a US citizen enrolled at an accredited institution pursuing a doctoral degree in policy-related housing and urban development issues. Now you might look at that and say, well, hold on, that's not really what I do. Well, I've seen quite a lot go under urban development, including a lot of education programs. So don't rule that out off the top of your head, but think about, is there something that I'm doing? Is there something that I'm interested in that overlaps with that? Now, of course, none of this is something that is a lifetime commitment. If you have a project you want to do or need to do, or if you're looking at taking another step in your education that will take you somewhere else, you might be looking for something that is designed to broaden your mind and experience and your understanding of things. So, for example, we've had several webinars earlier in this series looking at study abroad awards. And I know that the Fulbright advisor from ACU is strongly interested in having more people from the ACU Dallas campus applying for those. And that's something where you have an interest that takes you somewhere, but it's in the context of a larger educational and cultural exchange. And often people come back from that with very clear ideas about what they want to do because they've had their chance to try out doing and working on some of these things with the opportunity to pursue what really interests them. Now, let's go ahead and go back to talking about what kind of materials you would use for applying for funding. So if you're applying for a fellowship, you're usually going to need a curriculum vitae or resume, and by the way, those are related, but not quite the same. Curriculum vitae, resume, different formats, different levels of detail you include. They'll ask for some sort of proposal, narrative, or description. There's usually some sort of application form, almost always online these days, a budget, and for non-federal stuff, usually letters of recommendation. If you're applying for a federal grant, instead, they'll usually ask for some sort of evidence that you can do this. And that could involve having letters from partners. It could involve letters of support. It can involve work samples. But if you're applying for a fellowship for your individual funding, it's usually going to be a letter of recommendation. Now, if you're looking at a Fulbright Study Research Award, and by the way, they come in a variety of awards. This is just one of them, Study and Research Award. You'd need a CV. your narrative, the application form, a language evaluation if the country that you're applying for recommends requires it, and then 3 letters of recommendation. Now, if we're going to be discussing that, I can show you, hey, here is my actual proposal that I used, or part of it, uh, from when I applied for my Fulbright. What I did had some resemblance to this, but it diverged in that when I got there, the university I was teaching at asked me if I could teach something different. And, they were the partner here. They said that was what would be meeting the greatest need. And I said, if that's the greatest need, let's do it. So these often get transformed as you navigate through that. Now, if you're getting your material together for a proposal, the letters of recommendation are usually the bottleneck. They're usually the things that people stress about. And so here are some rules for how to go about doing that. First, if you're asking someone a letter, ask them at least a month in advance. 3 is preferred because people do like to go on vacation and they may have their own deadlines. But that's also time enough for you to be able to follow up and check in and supply additional material if needed. You want to give the person that you're writing a recommendation letter some cliff notes, if you will, a crib sheet of what they can draw on when writing your letter, like how you know them, how long, what kinds of things you've done together, because they might remember they've worked with you on this, but not remember what the name of that thing was. And keep in mind that if you're taking a class with someone and there are 50 people in that class, and they teach the class 3 times a year, that's 150 people. So help them write their letter well and in a timely fashion by giving them notes on that. Now, I should absolutely give them a copy of the CV or resume that you are submitting and a copy of any draft as far as you've gotten. And if you have something specific you'd like them to say about you or a list, then by all means tell them what that is. So that's an example of when I was writing my application, I had some details I wanted to stand out, including that I had done the kind of thing that they were looking to do to start a graduate writing program. And so when I was talking with my recommenders there, I had 2 deans writing my letters of recommendation. I gave them a list of things that I would like them to mention, and I gave them different lists. And that's how you can help shape this so that you get the details that you want to show your strengths. And this is something where if you are asking out of the blue, it may feel like more of an imposition than if this is the request for a letter is part of a longer conversation where they know, hey, you're interested in these things. They know that you're applying for this. Perhaps you've asked them for input on it. And then when it gets to the point where you have a proposal draft that's approaching where you want to submit it, then you ask for the letter. Or you give the formal ask, having already read it by them and said, when it comes closer, here's what I'm looking for. Now, there are also some specific areas of research where if you're in our EDD program, for example, you might be interested in some educational leadership research. And so here we have the NCER, the National Clearinghouse for Educational Research. And so they have awards that they manage in a variety of areas for different scales of projects, some of which are individual awards, some of which are funding a center. You can look at who's gotten the awards recently. You can look at the individuals involved. You can look at the goals for what they're trying to do on the research, and look back through that. So we're going to go ahead and go look at funding opportunities here. And so we see that, oh, hold on. They have some stuff available for training. So I know someone who got one of these specifically to run a training program at their school, basically about the things that they thought their program should have, which is a good way to write about what you know. When you have very strong opinions about something, that makes it a lot easier to write the application. But let's go ahead and take a look. For the sake of example, we're going to take a look at the special education research grants programs here, because this is something with a lot of funding going into now. And we can see, all right, yes, we have some classics like STEM that are coming up, but there is funding available for research in social, emotional, and behavioral competence. Awesome. We have things about the educator and school-based service provider relationship, cognition and student learning, and we have systems, policy, and finance. So this looks like one where IT admin in an education context could be something that fits under this. And if we were to look at this, we'd see that the advertisement is fairly broad. We're going to go ahead and just take a look at this one here. And let me go ahead and share my screen there. So the first thing you'll notice is that there's a lot here. This is a 36, no, it's still loading down here. Looks like it's still counting more pages. We're up to 77. So there's a lot here. Don't be intimidated by that. The goal is to find something that you are interested in. And so we're going to go ahead and take a look at let's start with the improving education systems. That's pretty broad. There's a lot of room for improvement in many systems. Things keep changing. So we see that this is research to understand the policies and systems and what makes them work better. So absolutely, that is something that there are a lot of opportunities in there. And we see that this is, we have the general purpose. And then here's some examples. It's not an exhaustive list, but here's some examples of things that they're particularly interested in. And they say, oh, these are things that have the potential to lead to advances in the field. So these are areas that they think this is a good place to spend some time. And it's actually really helpful when a funder says, here's the kind of thing we want, something like this, please. Because then you know that is something that they're interested in. You can look at and see how that might overlap with what you're interested in doing and what you are required to do. Now, if we were going in another direction, let's take a look at, I know we have a couple students in the program at ACU who are doing work on different areas of student cognition and learning. So we see that research on how people learn is valuable for all these things. That's a lot. And that's going outside of just, K-12 education. Knowing how people learn has huge applications in business contexts, especially if it's something where you're trying to teach people how to, follow good security practices and not get their computers hacked, which is an IT concern at so many institutions. So they identify some areas. They're particularly interested in AI, which makes sense. AI has been in the news a lot this year, ChatGPT and other things like that. But also looking at, oh, hold on. So for things that have been studied, what happens when we put these into practice? Now that they say particularly in science educations, it's not limited to that, but particularly interested in that. So if you were doing this and it happened to be with a science angle, which a lot of IT does, that's something they're saying they're extra interested in it. Okay, let us wrap things up here, and we'll head back to our slide deck here. So I've included some additional links for K-12 education research funding and for higher education grants. And you'll find that we also have in this slide deck, we have some other material that you would want for a grant as opposed to fellowship application. So they might call it a cover letter, they might call it a proposal letter, or most commonly a letter of inquiry, a summary of what you propose to do, a list of basically how you yourself or the team that you're on or organization you're part of will be able to do this. That's a list of qualifications. The problem statement, which again, they have given us on the pages we're looking at a lot of examples of things that they see a problem that is in need of solving or improvement. Program description, this is what you intend to do. And the evaluation plan, how will you measure things and know whether things are changing or improving or whatever it is that you're trying to get as the result. And if you have the problem and the program, the evaluation plan is fairly easy to do. It might require a little research to see what other people have done for that kind of thing, but it's fairly easy to do, especially if you go to the library and say, hey, I have a interest and I'm working on this. I don't know what questions people have asking to find if it works. And then usually our library staff will be able to narrow down what it is that you're looking at and find, oh, someone else was studying this kind of thing, but with a different group. Here's how they did your evaluation. And that brings us to our last thing, which is you don't need to reinvent the wheel. I will say that in my experience, when I have written people who got some award or grant or fellowship and asked if I could see a copy of their application, they usually sent it to me pretty quickly, often in the same day. For the most part, if you get some award, you're ineligible to apply for it for some period of time. And so people usually will share knowledge very freely and have benefited from that, from other people's generosity. And for something like an evaluation plan, using a method that someone else did is better because that means it's being tested. You've had an opportunity to validate it, and you can extend the body of knowledge by using it in a new context with new population or with some other variable that gets changed. So students often stress about the evaluation plan because they think they need to come up with something from scratch. But the reality is there's usually someone who's done something like it before or close enough that you have a basis for where to begin, if not using that tool that someone else has used already for your research as well, which actually really helps when you're writing the program description, because then you can say, oh, so I am using this well-validated thing that's been applied in similar contexts and found to be useful. Other things, financial plan, that's basically, in general, how are you going to pull this off? Then the budget is the specifics. And then sometimes they'll ask for letters of support or affiliation if you're working with a partner. And before we hang up for the day, some suggestions. First, start early. You can get feedback while your draft is still rough, but if you don't allow enough time to write, you'll have a high chance of errors sneaking in. And I'm going to, in the interest of disclosure, point out a typo here on this page. Now, I mentioned this was part of a successful application, but I can tell you that I left a space out there, or I inserted a space that didn't need to be there. It could be the other one, but it's inconsistent there. Will something like that throw you off and make you ineligible? No. But if you've got a ton of those, it may look sloppy and not reflect well on your ability to deliver the thing that you're promising. So allow time to write and to get another set of eyes to help polish things. Make sure you pay close attention to the instructions. Ask someone else if they can read your application and tell you what they think you're doing. If it's the same thing as you thought you were saying, great. If they get a different idea, then you might want to do some clarification in your writing. Make sure that you convey that this is something that you're interested in. And that can go many different ways. it can even be done without referring to yourself personally. If you describe, oh, this is a problem, and you describe the extent in a way that is convincing, usually citing the evidence. Usually where the failure to convey that is you say, oh, I propose to do this, and you don't say why that is important, or you don't explain. The numbers 6 and 7 are related. Lack of preliminary data, how do you know that this is something? You can have data of all sorts. It can be anecdotal, it can be quantitative, it can be qualitative, it can be experiential, but how do you know that this is a good direction to be going? And how do you know that this is something you can do? In which case, don't be shy about your qualifications. I've had people apply for awards, and in the draft I saw, completely leave out the fact that they had been teaching for decades in this environment. And so they had all sorts of on-the-ground experience that wasn't obvious in their application. So if that is something that you feel that you have trouble, not even bragging, but showing your qualifications, by all means, come into a meeting with your application materials, including that CV, because there might be things on that CV that, if you make more obvious in the rest of the application, will help answer that question for, are you able to do this? Are you qualified for it? Do you have experience doing this? Project that will have limited impact. This is related to the highly articulated the problem. And I think it's helpful to be able to cite other people who have said, hey, this is a problem. And so doing a literature search specifically to inform that might be very helpful. And the last one, limited support from your institution. In general, if you're a student in a graduate program, you want to have at least one letter of support or letter of recommendation from someone at your institution. There may be other people that you want to include, but at least one, so that it's not a conspicuous absence. All right, to put it another way, if it looks like you're being secretive about applying and not telling anyone at your institution, and there'll be a question on people's minds, hold on, they don't think that they would be backed by the department if they asked? And so just keep that in mind. You want to have a well-rounded set of supporting letters. Support isn't always financial. It's not just limited to letters, but again, showing the evidence of your being able to complete the project. And that could be faculty agreeing to advise, or for things that are staged as dissertation or dissertation-related research, having someone, a more experienced investigator, and principal investigator is the normal term used for researcher for many federal agencies. If you have a more experienced more experienced principal investigator who is working with you, that answers a lot of questions about how will you get through these things. You can see, oh, here's this other person, here are their qualifications, they're working as a team. So with that, I will just highlight this resource here and say, if you have some extra time, you can look at a sample of a grant application that I've included here. These are the specifics for the application. Here's my narrative that I used to get this award from the American Musicological Society. There's the budget that I used. And you can see some things there, like I had someone who offered to host me there. That's the last item on the budget. It's there not because I needed money for that, but I wanted to show that my budget was reasonable and that I had someone offering me housing so that I could actually do this project with the budget that they provided, with the budgetary room that they provided. So with that, let's wrap things up. Thank you for attending this webinar. And if you have questions or if there's a particular focus that you're looking for, please feel free to let us know. You can send us an email at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu, or in our RSVP form, you can indicate any special requests. We add new webinars every term based on student requests. So with that, have a great evening. Bye.